Okay, picking up from the last video, let's now talk about the intellectual foundations of the European model of capitalism. They go back to Thomas Hobbes. Thomas Hobbes was a believer in a bigger government, the idea that economic freedom, property rights, and private contracts may have to be a bridge for the public interest. In other words, we should be willing to sacrifice our individual rights in order to have a more stable society. The mercantilist perspective is also at work here. Mercantilism, favors a strong state that would control trade relationships and essentially empower the government to economically do what's in the best interest of that country. So the state will often sell licenses, charters, and grant monopoly rights to special interest groups. The historic European welfare state is another part of the foundation. This idea that government should serve as almost a charitable institution, a place, a last stop for people to get support when the market doesn't provide it. Government-sponsored programs that provide economic security and welfare. And as I mentioned, this is going to be one of the most dramatic divergences from the Anglo model, this welfare state, this government largesse to try to transfer funds from one group to another. This guy, Edward Bernstein, back in the late 1800s, early 1900s, talked about a concept known as revisionism. This is the goal of abandoning the Marxist ideal of a proletariat revolution and instead trying to win peaceful rights for workers through the form of a social democratic party in a democratic system. Remember, Marxism, whether Marx believed this or not, is about revolution. It's about bringing upon a workers' unification so that you can use the government to benefit the workers and create more equality, more social justice, all that kinds of things. The problem with that is it's a revolution and it brings about violence, it brings about resentment, and it can create a lot of negative consequences for the people and the economy in that process. So a better way, according to this revisionist perspective, is to adopt democratic systems and then have a party, the Social Democratic Party, to push for this kind of workers' rights, to push for the same thing that Marxism would bring about, but in a more peaceful way. And maybe not achieving the kind of communist utopia that Marx would have desired, but instead moving the kind of pendulum a little more towards that end. Some would say that this movement towards a social democratic party and revisionism is really just a way to head off the Marxist revolutionaries that were trying to overthrow capitalism. There's an old saying, if you want to preserve capitalism, you sometimes have to abandon capitalism. And that may not be the best solution for a free market-oriented people or a promoter of the Anglo model, but it might be a necessary solution. When you have a large underclass of people that are looking for some sort of equity, Marxism is very attractive. And you could head that off potentially by giving them assistance, a party that represents them, and more government provisions, more transfer payments, the old Robin Hood strategy, take from the rich, give to the poor, to pacify the poor. Otto von Bismarck, the German chancellor from 1871 to 1890, created the first major welfare legislation in Europe and paved the way for subsequent legislation. And he's quoted as saying, "My idea was to win over the working class, or maybe I should say to bribe them, for them to see the state as a social institution that exists because of them and for their benefit." So notice it's a little bit different than maybe what we thought the intentions were. His idea was to win them over, so there's a political motive there, but also bribe them so that they can see the state as an institution that exists because of them and for their benefit. So it's not just about helping the poor. It's also about political expediency, and it's about pacifying people so that there is less unrest. Now let's look at some of the elements of European corporations. One of the first elements is managerial capitalism. This is distinguished from shareholder capitalism that we saw in the Anglo model. Managerial capitalism emphasizes the stakeholders' interests over the shareholders' interests. Another way of putting this is profits are subordinated for the interests of the employees. Now, technically, a stakeholder can be anyone with a vested interest in the company, but for our purposes, we'll think of the biggest stakeholder as the employees. The presumed benefits of this style of capitalism include greater loyalty of employees and other business relationships. If the employees are a more integral part of the company's decision making, then they're more likely to stay with that company. They're more likely to feel like the company works for them as opposed to them just working for the company. This creates a stability that actually transcends the employee and helps out with other business relationships. Think about it. When you have employees in a company from the lowest level to the highest level, all the other relationships that business forms are tied to that. If the vendors, for example, that sell products to that company or the customers of that company, if they see a lot of turnover, if they see low loyalty, then they start to be compromised. They don't have that same kind of connection to the business that they would if it had more tenured employees and more consistency in those representing the company. This also allows for a longer term outlook for investment and training. When a company hires employees, they have to train them, and they do such based on the longevity of that employee. For example, if you were going to hire somebody to work in your business and you knew they were only going to be there for a year or two, you're probably not going to put as much effort in training them and investing in them as if you know they're going to be there for 10 or 20 or 30 years. Well, under this style of capitalism, the loyalty, the lower turnover leads to a greater amount of training and investment. So it can actually be pretty efficient from the standpoint of getting employees to their potential in terms of contribution to the firm. Downturns are absorbed by profits, not employment. In the shareholder form of capitalism, we see in a recession an attempt to maintain profits for the benefit of the shareholder, which means that unemployment often goes up a lot during a recession. Employees take the hit. But in managerial capitalism, we actually see the opposite. Profits end up being sacrificed to keep workers employed during the downturn. And then also greater equality of income within the firm. Look, the stakeholders have more representation in the company. The stakeholders may themselves be shareholders. There's more of an integration between the people supplying the capital and the people working in the company. Allows the company to maybe raise wages, even if it comes at the expense of lower profits, something that would be less likely to occur in shareholder capitalism. Next thing is cross-ownership. Corporations that own shares in other corporations are said to be cross-owned. And what this does is it often concentrates corporate control in the hands of a few large companies. Cross-ownership is much more common in European corporations for a variety of reasons we'll talk about as we progress. But it's a double-edged sword because on the one hand, this concentrated ownership, it does allow for stability among companies that might not otherwise be there. Think about it like this. If you've got, let's say, company A, B, and C that are all connected in terms of ownership, maybe A owns 80% of B and B owns 50% of C, something like that. So they're connected in a cross-ownership network. Well, if company C is experiencing financial difficulty, absent that cross-ownership, they may go bankrupt. But with that cross-ownership, company A and B have an interest in helping C. So it does facilitate a more hospitable environment for companies to continue on despite lower profits. The downside is that it reduces minority shareholder influence, and smaller investors are much less likely to get involved. I mean, think about it. If you're a shareholder and you've invested in company A or company B, and now C is going bankrupt, well, your profits are going to be sacrificed as an owner of A and B to subsidize bailing out C. So people often don't like to invest in companies that have these large cross-ownership patterns because they are at the mercy of the entire network as opposed to just taking the risk of the one company. So it's a mixed bag there, but you definitely see more cross-ownership in these networks in European corporations than you do in US Anglo-style capitalism. It's going to get even more significant when we get to the Asian model, where these massive networks are quite common. Interlocking directorates. These are where directors that serve on the board of multiple corporations. This is illegal in the U.S. So, for example, let's say Starbucks, Howard Schultz, he's the ex-CEO, but he still sits on the board of Starbucks. Well, in the U.S., he can't sit on the board of another coffee company. That would be an interlocking directorate, and it would preclude him from being objective and satisfying what we call the fiduciary obligation. As a board member for Starbucks, he has to make decisions that are in the best interest of Starbucks. He can't, when he's sitting on that board making, decisions for Starbucks, he can't take into consideration other coffee companies that he may have a connection to. So we don't allow him to sit on competing companies. It would be illegal. But we do allow in the U.S. him to sit on the board of non-competing companies. So Howard Schultz could sit on the board of Starbucks and Ford if he wanted to, because there's no violation of that fiduciary obligation. His commitment to Ford would not compromise his ability to be objective on the board of Starbucks. But within the same industry, intra-industry, that's illegal. In Europe, it's not. Interlocking directorates are commonplace, and it probably goes back to this cross-ownership idea. If you've got company A, B, and C that are unified in terms of ownership, then they're probably going to be unified in terms of directors as well. Someone that sits on the board of A is more likely to sit on the board of B and C to make those collectively beneficial outcomes. Again, same problem. Reduces minority shareholder influence and incentive for smaller investors to participate. Imagine that in the U.S. we did allow, let's say, Howard Schultz to sit on the corporate board of Coffee Bean. Well, if you're an investor in Starbucks, you say, well, here I am. I've got Starbucks stock. I want to get a profit from Starbucks, but I got this guy, Howard Schultz, that's making decisions for Starbucks, and he sits on the board of Coffee Bean. How can he possibly maximize my best interest when he has this issue, this conflict of interest, by being on a board of a competing company? So you'd be much less likely to want to invest in Starbucks in that environment. And that's one of the challenges for Europe. It's harder to attract investors, smaller investors, into big corporations because of this cross ownership and these interlocking directorates. We're going to see that there's a challenge for Europe to get capital to fund companies relative to the more Anglo model countries that don't have cross ownership and interlocking directorates. Insider trading. Insider trading is where a insider, typically the highest level executives in a company, has information about the company's performance that public shareholders do not possess. And that information would presumably allow them to make money at the outsider's expense. For example, if going back to Howard Schultz, if he knows that Starbucks is going to have this new promo on Frappuccinos and nobody else knows about that outside the company, then he could go and buy Starbucks stock, knowing full well when that information hits the press, it's going to raise the value of the stock and he could make money. Well, in the U.S., we've made that illegal. He can't do that. If he were to do that, he could end up in jail. You might want to read up on Martha Stewart because she was actually put in jail for insider trading. Very interesting kind of circumstance there, because Martha Stewart, America's mom, is actually was a licensed stockbroker on the New York Stock Exchange. So she knew better, but she ended up trading and violating our rules. Whereas if she had done that same thing in some of the European countries, there wouldn't have been as much of an issue. There's less insider trading laws that exist. Let me go ahead and pull up this hyperlink here and show you. This will take us to the site Yahoo Finance. And you can go into, I've got Starbucks here because I'm talking about it. You can go in here and click on the profile of the company, and it'll give you the insider roster. So you've got all these people. These are insiders, and because they're insiders, they have to disclose all their stock transactions. They can't act on it. There's even a blackout period where these insiders can't trade on the stock because they have information that has not been made public yet. All right, guys, we'll pick up in the next video with this bullet. Thanks.